The story I'm going to read to you today is called Araminta's Paint Box by Karen Ackerman, illustrated by Betsy Lewin. A pioneer story. In 1847, Dr. Marcus Darling lived in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, with his wife Emily and his young daughter Araminta. Dr. Darling was well respected in Boston. He worked long hours and sometimes drove his buggy for miles to bring a baby into the world, or to set a broken leg or tend a snake bite. He was a very good doctor, and both Amelia and Araminta were proud of him. Dr. Darling became so admired in Boston that he was offered a position as the very first doctor in the western town from far away in a place called California. There was talk that California would soon become a state, which meant that settlers would begin moving west to buy land. Where there were people, there were need for a doctor. The Darling family packed everything they could fit in a large wagon drawn by a team of strong draft horses. In those days, they had horses to take them wherever they wanted to go in a wagon. They didn't have cars. Amelia's beautiful old settee, the doctor's examination table, and Araminta's toy chest poked out of the back of the wagon, and cooking pans and pots clanged against the wagon sides where Amelia and Araminta had tied them. Dr. Darling locked the front door of the family's lovely old Boston home, and with a slap of his reins, he and his family began the journey westward. See the cooking pans right there on the side of the wagon? And there's the settee, which is like a couch. They followed the road to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where they planned to visit the doctor's only brother, who was a minister, and the rest of themselves and the team of horses, who was a minister, and to rest themselves and the team of horses, because that was a long ways from New York or from Boston. The doctor and his brother hadn't seen each other for nearly 10 years. So when he arrived, there were a lot of hugging and shaking hands and kissing cheeks. There they are, hugging and kissing. Araminta's uncle, the Reverend Jacob Darling, had never even met her before. But before the doctor and his family left Scranton, Uncle Jacob gave Araminta a paint box to take with her to California. For my sweet niece on her journey, Uncle Jacob whispered to young Araminta, and he patted her cheeks. The Darlings waved goodbye, and Araminta held the paint box tightly in her arms as she sat in the back of the wagon. Araminta's paint box was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was nearly 2 feet long, and there were 2 rows of paint jars at the top. On each side of the handle there was a deep hole filled with quills and brushes, and in the middle of the box was a thick roll of drawing paper wrapped in satin ribbon. Araminta touched every jar of paint and every quill and brush. She couldn't wait to begin a painting. Just look at her, the painting she started. They followed the road through Pennsylvania toward Ohio, where they would load their wagon onto a boat and ride the Ohio River to Illinois, and then cross the great muddy Mississippi. The ride through the Pennsylvania farmlands was hot and dusty, and Araminta had a difficult time painting in the back of the wagon. The dust whirled up and stuck to the wet paint and coated the bristles of her paintbrushes. Now and then the wagon pitched to one side, going over a rock or bump, and the tin cup full of water for rinsing brushes would tip over and soak Araminta's skirt and petticoat. So those days they wore skirts or dresses and also had petticoats underneath. When the wagon unexpectedly struck a boulder that had tumbled from a hillside, everything inside went flying into the air. Amelia's lovely settee sailed out and landed upside down in the road, and Araminta's paint jars rolled out every which way, and the doctor's examining table tumbled out onto the road and stood upright as if waiting for the doctor's next patient. The doctor walked through the fields toward the farmhouse to find someone to help him replace the wagon's new broken wheel. The farm was owned by a Mennonite family named Friedlander, and Mr. Friedlander was willing to help, but when the wagon was hoisted up and the broken wheel replaced, Araminta's paint box slipped out of their wagon. Araminta didn't notice that it was missing until the family had traveled too far to go back for it. Araminta's beautiful paint box was lost. Just look at that. It fell and she forgot to get it up. Daniel Friedlander was helping his father tie hay bales on the afternoon when he tripped over something of a box lying in the field. It was a very nice paint box, though it was only 4, and there were several sheets of roll-up drawing paper. When he showed the box to his papa, Mr. Friedlander knew it had fallen out of the wagon that had broken its wheel on the road near his farm the week before. "They won't be back for it now," Mr. Friedlander said to his son. They had missed the boat down the Ohio River. They turned back. The paint box remained with the Friedlanders, and the box proved to be very useful. Mrs. Friedlander used the box to trim her kitchen walls in brightly stenciled hearts and flowers and curlicues. She used up all the blue paint and half of the red. Daniel drew pictures of his prize heifer on sheets of drawing paper, and Mr. Friedlander used the box to carry his carpenter tools. So they used the paints and the box because they couldn't do anything else. They wouldn't be able to even know the address of where they would be staying in California. So they went ahead and used it in their own way. One day Mr. Friedlander went to a barn raising for a young couple who were to be married the next week. Farmers from all over the county came to help raise the new barn on the farm, and when the young couple would live there after their wedding, Mr. Friedlander took his toolbox with him. The groom's best man arrived in a coach from Illinois, and as soon as he stepped off of the coach, he rolled up his shirt sleeves and set to work. Another passenger boarded the coach, bound for the Mississippi River. But while the sides of the great barn were raised, the empty wooden box was mistakenly put on the coach by the driver. Before rolling down the road back to Illinois, Mr. Friedlander's toolbox was lost. So now it's going down the Mississippi. The coach driver stopped in Springfield to let off his passenger and have a hot bath and a good meal before going on further north. The wooden box was taken from the coach and set near the passenger steamer's trunks. The passenger was a riverboat gambler named Doolittle. He took another coach on to Hannibal, Missouri, where he boarded the riverboat Blue Belly on the Mississippi River, but he didn't notice the wooden box that was taken aboard the Blue Belly with his steamer trunks. The box rode the great Mississippi southward. Doolittle had a run of bad luck, and he lost his entire fortune in games of chance within a week. At the spot where the great Mississippi meets the Missouri River, he left the Blue Bell and his steamer trunks, and the wooden box was put on the dock. But thinking the box belonged to someone else, Doolittle left it where it was. The wooden box lay unclaimed on the dock for 2 weeks. See the steamers that they would ride in? They're quite large. A young bride traveling west to meet her husband in Colorado waited at the same dock for a boat to carry her down the Missouri to the Kansas River and on to the Bent's Fort. As she waited, she noticed a large wooden box lying nearby. The young bride's husband, Captain Beaumont, was in Bent's Fort training troops for battle in the war with Mexico. Expecting that the war would end quickly, he sent word for his wife to join him, but Captain Beaumont had no idea that his wife was going to have their first child. Young Mrs. Beaumont thought the large box would make a lovely bassinet for her new baby. After she inquired and was told that no one had claimed it, she had the box loaded with the rest of her cases. The wooden box went down the Missouri River. After taking another boat from the Missouri down the Kansas River, young Mrs. Beaumont boarded a coach to take her the rest of the way to Bent's Fort, where her husband would be waiting for her. That's where he was stationed. But Bent's Fort was a flurry of activity when she arrived. Soldiers scurried about, packing their horses to ride south to New Mexico, where a battle was going on. Captain Beaumont unloaded his wife's cases quickly, apologized to her for having to leave, and rode off through the high gate of Bent's Fort with his cavalry troops thundering behind him. Mrs. Beaumont managed to settle in by herself, and by the time she noticed that the wooden box was not with her cases, it was too late. The captain had left the box on the coach, not realizing it belonged to his wife. Mrs. Beaumont's baby bassinet was lost. That item is getting lost all the time, it seems. The coach traveled from Bent's Fort to the South Pass at the base of the Continental Divide. The only passengers were a Mormon family who was left off at the edge of the South Pass. They planned to cross the mountain range on horseback and go westward to a new community on the Great Salt Lake settled by Mormons from the east. The family was called Kellinger, and Elijah was their youngest son. Elijah was the first to notice the large wooden box laid atop his family's baggage when the coach left them off at the edge of the pass. "Whose is it, Papa?" he asked his father, who called out to the coach to come retrieve it, but the coach driver did not hear him. The box crossed the mountains, tied to the saddle of Elijah's horse. So there it is. See, it's all tied to that little boy's horse as they're crossing the mountain now. They're going to cross that big, big mountain. When the Kellingers arrived at Great Salt Lake, the whole community came out to greet them. Each family had made the same journey and knew how difficult it was to leave everything behind in the east for a new life out of west. First, the Kellingers were driven in a neighbor's wagon to see the Great Salt Lake, which was the center of the new settlement. Just look at that family, and here's their puppy. The other families arranged for a group supper to welcome the Gallagher's. Tables were set up along the shores of the lake, and all of the Mormon families in that area attended the picnic. Each family offered a blessing at the table for the newcomers, and the other children gathered around Elijah to ask where he'd come from and what school grade he was in. Meanwhile, the old prospector drove his mule. An old prospector drove his mule southeast along the Oregon Trail. The gold rush had just begun in California, and the prospector wanted to be among the first to stake a claim. He followed the trail to the edge of the Great Salt Lake, where it curved westward and joined the California Trail. When he reached the junction of the two trails, the prospector saw a group of people gathered at the edge of the lake. They were having supper, and the prospector needed fresh water and food supplies. He urged his mule down to the lake shore. When he asked for fresh water and a bit of jerky or beans, he was happily given a plate piled high with food. The prospector ate well and gave his tired mule a long rest. The old prospector received much more than he had asked for. Several crates of supplies were tied to his mule pack, and each family gave him something for his journey. But the Gallagher's had left nearly all of their belongings back east, so Elijah offered the prospector the wooden box. The box would be just the right size to carry nuggets with California gold running through them, so the prospector accepted the box with thanks. Tied to the end of the old prospector's mule pack, the box went to California. The old prospector mined for months in the hills before he found gold. Then he loaded the wooden box with nuggets streaked with yellow gold and walked to town to file his claim at the land office. But as the old prospector stepped through the tall, thick weeds at the edge of the town, he felt a sharp pain in his ankle. He'd been bitten by a snake. He hobbled to town as quickly as he could and fainted cold on the steps of the local doctor's office. The doctor rushed out and carried him into his office, where he gave the old prospector some snake bite medicine, cleaned and dressed the wound. Just look at him. There he is on the ground. When the old prospector woke, he told the doctor that he could pay him in gold for his help. The doctor's young daughter was sent outside to bring in the old prospector's mining box, which had been left on the steps while he had fainted. Although the old prospector became very rich and famous because of his gold claim, the doctor who had saved his life did not want any more than the wooden mining box for payment. Dr. Darling planned to make a paint box out of it, like the one his daughter Araminta had lost long before on their journey to California. So he didn't necessarily want the gold. He wanted the box because this was Dr. Darling, the doctor that we talked about in the very beginning of the story. So that was interesting to know that in the end, Dr. Darling saw the paint box, that one just like his daughter Araminta had. Araminta lost it, and now she got it back again. How about that? That is an interesting little story telling about that box that went to all kinds of places and with all kinds of people. We thank you for listening to this story, which was interesting. I hope you liked it, and God bless.